In this series, we cover the many products, promos, and pack-ins available to support Dungeon Masters and players within the world of Eberron. In this video, I'm covering miniatures created for grid-based role-playing of characters and monsters over many iterations of the game by Wizards of the Coast and licensees like WizKids and Gale Force 9. This is the Eberron Collector. Goblins have an interesting role in Eberron, and by looking at the various goblinoid miniatures available over the years and product lines, we can highlight ones that are specific to Eberron. Goblins come in three disparate but related forms. There are three species that co-inhabit and are interconnected. The small-sized goblins are often considered nuisances by humans, and in many settings are described like they are in the 4th edition Monster Manual. Goblins are wicked and treacherous creatures that love plunder and cruelty. And in the 3.5 edition Monster Manual, if they are left unchecked, their great numbers and rapid reproduction and evil disposition enable them to overrun and despoil civilized areas. Hobgoblins, their medium-sized cousins, are shown to be more militaristic but no less evil. In the 5th edition Monster Manual, they are called aggressive humanoids whose thirst for conquest is never satisfied. Bugbears are the largest of the goblinoids. They are still medium-sized in the game, though almost approach the large size category. Big, tough goblins that love to fight. Bugbears are picked guards and muscle for more clever goblins, is their description in the 4th edition Monster Manual. So goblinoids have a reputation for evil and cruelty in the core worlds of D&D, but they have a different role in Eberron. Goblinoids in Eberron have their own homeland nation in Khorvaire, Dargoon, and are one of the key pre-human inhabitants of the continent. Back about 5,000 years ago, near the end of the age known as the Age of Monsters, the goblinoid empire of Dakan spread from shore to shore on Khorvaire, master of all except pockets of orcs, halflings, and gnomes, as those races did not have much in the way of territorial ambitions. They had founded great cities like Josharat, whose ruins later became Sharn, and left monuments to their mythical kings in a number of places around the continent. There were conflicts with Dragonborn out of Kabara, and expansionist Terranadel elves coming over from Erenal, and other wars over the centuries of Dakani rule. But it didn't really come crashing down until invaders from beyond the stars arrived, the Dalkir of Zoriat. While some Dakani goblins and gatekeeper orcs were able to seal away the lords of the Dalkir, who had come to Khorvaire with powerful magics, the writing was on the wall for the Empire. Remnants of great clans locked themselves away in great underground vaults, away from the horrors of the Zoriat War and its aftermath. Goblins have no need for sunlight after all, so these clans survived and preserved the traditions of the Empire into the modern day. With the recent emergence of Dargoon, some of these vaults have opened and their occupants have started to come back to the surface, believing that now might be the time to revive the Empire, as now goblins have a new nation as a starting base of power. Some of the known heirs of Dakan clans are the Ketch Valar, or Word Bearers, also called the Keepers of the Word, the Ketch Drawl, the Keepers of the City, the Ketch Ruska, the Keepers of the Tiger, and the Ketch Sharat, the Keepers of the Blade, or Bladebearers. Though this is just scratching on the surface of the many surviving clans. This miniature is one of those Ketch Sharat, a soldier of the Keepers of the Blade, and is called a Bladebearer Hobgoblin. It was released in the D&D miniatures game set Aberrations in 2004, where it was an uncommon. Bladebearers hadn't been illustrated before the concept art for this miniature, which was drawn by Steve Prescott, though it does have similarity in look to some of the other hobgoblins he has illustrated, like this unused picture commission for the book 5 Nations, and his image for Kurrok, Lesh of Dargoon, used in the Eberron campaign setting book. The Ketch Sharat are the most warlike, and only of the heirs of Dakan that are already operating in the open and without disguising their history, which the other Dakani tribes that have re-emerged are doing. They have access to more Bayashk ore than most other clans. This dark purple to red-hued metal is heavier than iron, and is anathema to aberrations like those created by the Dalkir. The blade bearers, artificers, and smiths forge Bayashk into great weapons of war. This alternative version of the Bladebearer Hobgoblin miniature was also released in 2004, but outside of one of the standard D&D miniature game sets. It was released as a player rewards promo, basically a reward given out at conventions or mailed to you for playing or DMing a lot of organized play events. The promo was accompanied by the same standard stat card as the Aberrations version. The role-playing stats on the stat card depict the Bladebearer as a 4th level fighter with 2+1 short swords. Bladebearers are also key antagonists in the 4th edition Dungeon Magazine issue 167 adventure, Heart of the Forbidden Forge, and appears as a standard foe in the Eberron campaign guide, where they are 5th level skirmisher monsters wielding 2 scimitars. So these 2 miniatures were clearly in mind when they designed that foe. This alternate figure's weapons have a deep red metallic hue, and I surmise that the intent was to depict blades forged Bayashk. In Dakani tradition, the Golindar, as goblins are called in the goblin language, have a primary role in society as labor, both skilled and unskilled. However, there are some respected orders of monks, scouts, spies, and assassins known as the Keshdar, or Silent Folk. Even before the fall of the Empire, they lived an ascetic, hidden life, so more easily survived the transition to living underground without a full society available to them. There are 2 main subgroupings of the Keshdar: the Sharat Kesh, or Silent Knives, who focus more on spycraft and infiltration, and the Tarkakesh, who focus more on strategy and scouting, and have an ancient connection to wargs, which is why they are called the Silent Wolf Goblins in the common tongue. That is the name of this common miniature from the Aberration set. Like the Bladebearer, it's not modeled on any specific goblin art that preceded it in a gamebook, though its concept art was drawn by Steve Prescott as well. As a common, there are very few paint steps in this miniature overall, and the bare black plastic is exposed on the majority of it. The role-playing stats on the D&D miniatures game stat card show the goblin as a dual-class ranger rogue, which seems appropriate to the Tarkakesh, though if it was a Sharat Kesh, it would more likely be some combination of rogue and monk, or if available, a ninja or assassin class or subclass. The goblins of the Dakani Empire are not known for their arcane magic, nor belief in the gods and the divine magic those beliefs might inspire. Dakani magic, and that of the heirs of Dakan, is primarily bardic from their Durkala dirge singers, or item-based with their Dashor artificers. Wizards and sorcerers are uncommon among the modern heirs of Dakan, but the Dar, who were left on the surface, are just as willing to study magic, or absorb energy from the manifest zones or the rings of Sybaris to grant them magical gifts, just like anyone else. Kurrok the Elementalist must be one of these hobgoblins that are bucking the cultural trend away from arcane magic. This miniature appeared in the Heroscape game, published by Wizards of the Coast as part of the Wave 12 Warriors of Eberron group of sets, specifically a pack called Heroes of Corvair. Heroscape was a miniature combat game with a hexagonal battlefield and heroes and monsters appearing from many worlds and time periods, so it was possible to battle Marvel's The Hulk against dragons and World War II soldiers. In the game, Kurrok is a sorcerer from Eberron, specializing in controlling and summoning elementals, which were released in an earlier D&D themed expansion. As you can see, Kurrok is on a standard 1-inch base, but it is the light brown plastic used in Heroscape, with a sticker depicting grass on top. Kurrok's miniature is based on an earlier D&D miniature game sculpt called Red Hand War Sorcerer. There are only subtle differences between the two miniatures other than the base, basically just the color of their cloaks. Kurrok's is dark brown, where the War Sorcerer's is a very dark gray. The War Sorcerer Mini was produced to support a 3.5 edition adventure called The Red Hand of Doom, which takes place in the world of Greyhawk. But it is a fairly generic adventure, so any setting that features Tiamat as a god can adapt it easily. But that does mean that this Eberron miniature is based on a mini intended for another setting, and it's not the last of those, even in this video. As the most populous of the goblinoids, regular goblins are the most diverse of Corvair's goblinoid population. Groups of goblins can be found in almost every region of Corvair, and goblins are often found outside of goblin-only communities. City goblins can be found in the slums, sometimes into the middle classes, but usually see themselves as part of that nation that they live in as much as any dwarf, gnome, or human that they live alongside. Other goblins work under monstrous chiefs, or bosses in the goblin language. Everything from gnolls, ogres, trolls, or more might act as one of their chiefs, especially in Droem. Strength and menace are the qualities a chief most often embody, and they may lead their goblins through fear. This goblin, along with its 3 other cohorts, is a Goblin Cutter. It is likely one of those that follow an Ogre Chief, as they are from the Heroscape expansion pack Ogre and the Goblins, from Wave 12 Warriors of Eberron. Unfortunately, Heroscape did not use appropriately sized bases for small-sized creatures like goblins, and it is on a 25mm or 1-inch medium-sized base instead. So you may feel the need to rebase them onto 20mm bases for correct representation. This particular cutter has the same sculpt and paint scheme other than the red accent color on the skirt as the Goblin Blackblade figure as the 2006 D&D Miniatures game set War Drums, which does show what this miniature would look like on the correctly sized base. Goblins do also often gather among other goblinoids, so it's common to see the Golindar, or the quick people, living with hobgoblins, known as the Galdar in the goblin language, which translates to mighty people, and bugbears, or Guldar, the strong people. Each of the 3 goblinoids are connected and take on specific roles within these all-goblinoid groups. As I mentioned earlier, the goblins act as artisans and a labor force, hobgoblins act as organizers and warriors, and have an important cultural roles like the Durkala bards, or Shore artificers. And bugbears take on roles where their size and skills in stealth come into play. The roles that hobgoblins and bugbears have in other settings as bullies of goblins is much less common in Eberron. The second of the 4 Goblin Cutters, from the same Heroscape set, is equipped with a spear, so it might find it difficult to do the slashing damage to live up to its Goblin Cutter name. The Heroscape Mini is a repurposed Goblin Runner miniature from 2006 D&D Miniatures game set War Drums, and shares the exact same paint scheme as that miniature. Oddly, the Heroscape Goblin Cutters are not the only D&D miniatures of that name. There is one from the 2009 Legendary Evils set, the D&D Miniatures game. That cutter wields a knife, so actually makes more sense with the name, and has the green skin that goblins sometimes had in 4th edition, even though they rarely have anything other than yellow, orange, or brown skin in 3rd and 5th editions. Goblinoids of all types from many different clans were hired out by the dragon-marked house Deneth as part of their blade-marked mercenary companies, throughout the entire length of the last war. Groups of disconnected goblin tribes from all over Khorvaire became in contact with each other for the first time as they were doing this mercenary work for one side of the war or another. Cyri especially hired a huge number of mercenaries, and at a certain point, enough goblin, hobgoblin, and bugbear mercenaries were stationed in the region of southwestern Cyri that Kurrok Tor, the chieftain of the Rukan-Tash tribe, was able to organize a number of disparate mercenary groups and rebel against the nations which hired them. That is how Kurrok became the Lesh, or High Warlord of the new nation of Dargoon. The third cutter from the Heroscape set wields a war pick, so another piercing weapon that will have difficulty making cuts. This sculpt is the same as a strange pick to be a goblin from Eberron. The Lolth-bound goblin from 2008's appropriately named Demon Web set of the D&D miniatures game matches this cutter's form exactly, but the Lolth-bound goblin has the odd choice of purple skin, so the binding with the Spider Queen must have given them the hue change to their skin. Of course, Lolth is not a goddess that exists in Eberron. She exists primarily in the world of Greyhawk, the Forgotten Realms, and the Points of Light setting of 4th edition. Other than the skin color, this cutter also changed the color scheme of the rest of the mini, and takes on the black and red scheme of the other Goblin Cutters from the set. In other D&D settings, goblinoids are often portrayed as inherently evil, and that is what causes strife between the so-called good races, like humans, dwarves, and elves, and the goblins. But in Eberron, it's almost the opposite. The Dar were the undisputed lords of Khorvaire for millennia, and had the misfortune of having their homes targeted by alien creatures from beyond the material plane, and thus their control over the continent diminished. If not for the colonization of Khorvaire by humans from Sarlona, they likely would have eventually rebuilt new kingdoms here. At this point, though, humans have become the dominant species in Khorvaire, and they are looting the natural, magical, and historical resources of the continent. And this is what causes the conflict between the goblinoids and other races. As a colonized people, the goblinoids are usually not actually the bad guys in the conflict, as your adventuring party is the one traipsing through ancient tombs, stealing their ancestors' relics. The last of the Heroscape minis, and this video's last overall miniature, is also a Goblin Cutter without a cutting weapon, this time a harpoon. You can see a little coil of rope there to allow them to pull back whatever creature is hooked. Let me show you the Heroscape stat card for all 4 of the cutters. I don't understand the game enough to explain the abilities, but on the back you can see the world of origin, Eberron. Like all the other cutters, this figure is based on a sculpt from the D&D miniatures game, the Goblin Picador from 2008's Dungeons of Dread. A Picador is a lancer from bullfighting that is mounted, so I don't know why a harpoonist on foot is called one here. The paint scheme was changed a lot between the 2 versions. The original has a subtle dark brown paint on the tunic, which is not replicated on the cutter. Also, the skin color was darkened from a yellow to a slightly deeper brown, and the goblin's bracers were changed from a natural leather color to the red accent color of all of the cutters. So that is it for Eberron-specific goblinoid miniatures for Dungeons & Dragons. Unfortunately, what we have is overall a little limited, and nothing from the current miniature licensors WizKids or Gale Force 9. And all but one of the goblins is on the wrong sized base. Not to mention that the D&D Heroscape miniatures are very hard to come by these days. The 2 miniatures from the D&D miniatures game set Aberrations, the Silent Wolf Goblin, and Bladebearer Hobgoblin, are ones I highly recommend getting copies of. On the secondary market, they are still relatively inexpensive. They have great sculpts and only slightly below expectation paint jobs. Both are highly useful to represent Eberron archetypes, assuming you steer clear of the promo Bladebearer, which is a bit more pricey. A few goblinoid archetypes have no miniature options at all, though they still have an important role in Eberron, so it'd be nice to get miniatures for. specifically the Durkala Dirgesinger Bard and the Dashor Artificer. And of course there's no bugbear miniatures based on Eberron illustrations either. It would also be nice to have a miniature for Dargoon's Lesh, Kurrok. I think a mini based on his original Steve Prescott art, or one based on how he looks on the cover of the novel Doom of Kings, illustrated by Michael Cormack, would also have been great. Goblins, Dargoon, and or Dakan are likely future topics for Library of Korenborg episodes, so I do hope you return to see those in the future. Subscribe to make sure you don't miss them. And of course, if you have a question about these minis, or if I've made a mistake, I want you to correct me, so please leave a comment or email me at eberronarchaeologist@gmail.com.